what I've showed you every single week. We're all secular now. This is James K.A. Smith, who puts it very succinctly, and that's about the best way to put it. So it's not us drawing lines between ourselves and those secular people over there. We all inhabit this same world. We have different ways of inhabiting the world. We have different paths that we've chosen. We have different beliefs that we have adopted. But we're all inhabiting this same secular world together. All right? So then last week, I think it was, or maybe it was the week prior, we talked about what Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. And immanent is the opposite of transcendent. So if something is transcendent, it rises above observed reality. But if it's immanent, it exists within the frame of observed, experienced reality. And the immanent frame is how Taylor describes the worldview, the secular worldview that we are all now a part of, right? It is a worldview in which all of our religious beliefs and understandings sort of happen on the terms of an immanent frame, on the terms of a world that is more or less closed off to supernatural forces and interventions. And within that world, within that framing then, the different religions of the world find their expression, or it's on the grounds of the immanent frame that they have to argue against the immanent frame, if that makes sense. So think about like Christian apologetics of the last 200 years trying to prove the existence of God or something like that. They do it by rational means, right? And reason is the sort of the bedrock of the Enlightenment and the immanent frame. So using the tools of secularism to argue against secularism. Does that make sense? All right? Fighting fire with fire, if you will. But the point being, this is the starting place, right? This is our starting place. It's within the immanent frame that you can choose your spiritual journey. It's within the immanent frame that science and religion have to find a way to be mutually comprehensible, because religion has a tendency to speak in ways that go beyond the immanent frame, and so religion has to explain itself, since that doesn't really fit in our worldview, right? So that's the immanent frame. Questions about that? It's deep, but it's I think I've used this expression before, but it's the wallpaper, right? It is the I don't remember who, somebody I haven't read but just heard quoted, called it the unthought, right? This is our unthought. It's something that exists for us, but we don't think about it. We don't see it. But of course, once we do see it, we have to think about it, right? We have to think about what that means and what the implications are. Okay, we're all secular. We all inhabit the immanent frame. So Taylor describes what he calls spiritual tensions that arise for those of us, and I'm not making a distinction here between religious people and non-religious people, okay? Everybody who inhabits this immanent frame will sense to one extent or another. There's a somewhat shady seat up here, Russ, or next to Howard over here. There are some shady seats to be had for now, but then, the sun will... all right, so these spiritual tensions are forces, factors that kind of push us against the limits of the immanent frame, that lead us to feel a kind of dissonance with the immanent frame as we experience it, right? For those who are people who are not of religious faith, these have a tendency to kind of push the boundaries of their vocabulary or their explanation. For religious people, we have the vocabulary, we have the explanation, but these are the kinds of things that often test our own explanations of things, right? The ways that we've made sense, or the religious stories that we've told, they don't always thrive in the face of some of these tensions. So they are tensions that are experienced by all of us. And the first of them, and I've brought this up before in different contexts, but the problem of suffering. Now, in the imminent frame, for people who are not religious, the problem of suffering does not sound like, why would a good God allow bad things to happen, right? That's not the problem of suffering that we're talking about now. What we're talking about is, I keep hitting the mic when I do this. We're talking about our own suffering and the problems that creates for us. Some, when they suffer, feel the need for an answer, and others maybe don't. Maybe others are better able to live through suffering without needing an answer for suffering. But what suffering presents to all of us is a kind of vulnerability. It's a reminder that remember when we talked about disenchantment, and we talked about ourselves being buffered selves, meaning we're no longer at the mercy of the spirits and forces around us. We have this kind of protection. But when we suffer, we are in a way vulnerable to the world, and that vulnerability is something we kind of thought we had taken care of, right? And in our understanding of the world, we don't think of ourselves as fundamentally vulnerable, but suffering brings out that sense of vulnerability in us. Does that make sense? There are different ways that we address that vulnerability or our need for an answer, you might say. Some, we often will create a story or embrace a story, I should say, that gives meaning to suffering. Sometimes that story is something as simple as, those people don't matter, right? Bigotry is a story that helps us come to terms with suffering, right? Those people don't matter. That's one way. Or apathy is a more benign form of keeping others and their suffering at arm's length so we don't personally have to deal with it. We can also address that vulnerability through action, right? We can work to help the suffering who are around us. We can be overwhelmed by the suffering around the world, and some of us, that motivates us to change the world, right? To heal the world, to feed the hungry all over the world, which none of us can do single-handedly, but those efforts are, in a way, a response to the vulnerability that we sense in the face of suffering. And these responses are both religious and non-religious, right? You have non-religious social justice warriors who want to see an end to poverty and hunger around the world, right? Not because of any religious conviction, but because they believe it's good and right and that every person should work towards those ends. By the same token, you have religious people who are perfectly happy to write off a whole category of people as maybe outside of the purposes of God. For instance, the Jews. Christians have been happy to say that for quite a long time. Thankfully, not so much anymore. But religious people can also have that more bigoted or apathetic or calloused stance toward suffering. Right? So one of the tensions of living in the imminent frame is that experience of vulnerability that we have in the face of suffering. Our suffering or the suffering of others. Does that make sense? All right, another tension of living in the imminent frame is that we all, in different ways and at different times, recognize the value of ordinary life. That ordinary life is filled with things that have rich, deep meaning. And this could be the birth of a child, so it can be like really great things, but it can also be, to go back to the suffering, it can be the death of a loved one, right? These are, we have religious language for these things. These are holy moments. These are moments where our spirits are open to God. Others would experience it or articulate it differently. But we all have that experience. But other things like a rock concert or some other kind of music concert that is especially moving, or a worship service that is especially moving, or other kinds of collective events like 9/11. When I talk to my kids about September 11th and what happened, I can hardly talk about it without feeling a wave of emotion pass over me, because that trauma was seared in my experience, but it was a collective trauma. And when I'm articulating that, I feel a sense of connection to all the other citizens of my country in a way that I don't ordinarily feel, right? Taylor mentions the death of Princess Diana as being one of those kind of galvanizing historical moments where people in a certain part of the world anyways share in a moment that feels organizing, right? It feels like the kind of moment that some would express in religious terms, but we all recognize that there is a depth to it, right? And so that recognition cuts against the flattening of reality that the Enlightenment brought about. Everything can be, understood through reason. Everything ultimately can be accomplished through the human implementation of our reason. There's nothing that is beyond our ability to grasp or achieve, right? And all the meaning that exists in the world is the meaning that we can make, right? And the Romantics very early on thought that was bogus, and we all have a sense that there is something to ordinary life that we would say is sacred, right? But that's not the language that everyone uses. So again, we're talking about tensions that exist for anybody as we just inhabit the immanent frame. Does that make sense? So far, so good? All right. Is there an exam? Yes. It'll be administered by St. Peter, Fred. So you'd better pay attention. All right. So I got ahead of myself. The meaning-rich moments we've already talked about. So I kind of collapsed number 2 and 3. We have the value of ordinary life and then meaning-rich moments. So sort of collective traumas or celebrations, sporting events, concerts, and so on. But the other thing about these meaning-rich moments is they have that positive effect in our lives. That is, the sort of organizing. They kind of they can give us a sense of identity, or they can help direct our loves. But when we lose our connection to those meaning-rich moments, what it can feel like is the loss of our identity, right? It can feel like the loss of a story, and our own sense of ourselves or the world can disintegrate. It can disintegrate. It can start to come apart. Mark, you have a thought?
I have a question on tension. How you're using the word tension. Is this tension between someone who kind of has an older transcendental frame and trying to understand the immanent frame, or is it a tension people within the immanent frame? It seems like those people, someone who just lives in the immanent frame, would have a different sense of tension than someone who's trying to come out of the transcendental.
So what I'm saying is that I'm using the word tension to mean those of us, which is all of us, who live within the immanent frame. And we're going to talk in a moment. There are different ways to inhabit the immanent frame. To say that we all inhabit the immanent frame doesn't mean that we all don't believe in God, right? But we all inhabit this new-ish worldview. That is expressed by Taylor's phrase, the immanent frame. And the tensions that exist are tensions that we all sort of sense intuitively, whether we're religious or not, with we kind of bump up against the boundaries of the immanent frame, if you will. And these are those tensions that make us feel...
The problem of the immanent frame, that these tensions exist.
Yes, these are the things that give us the clue that there are problems with the immanent frame, right? That sort of are the leading indicators that this is not a perfectly suited worldview, at least to those of us who are human, right? And have hearts and minds and passions and so forth. So, all right, and the last one I'm calling the shadow of death. Taylor basically says we don't know what to do with death. We don't know what to do with it in the immanent frame. Death creates a sense in virtually all of us. We're talking in particular the death of loved ones. That it is a violation of the connections of love, right? That our loving connections suggest to us in a precognitive sort of way that there's something there that should endure. But death is a violation of that sense, that there should be something enduring about love, and death kind of cuts that off at the knees. And so in the imminent frame, we don't know what to do with death. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to confront it. Very often we frame funeral services in terms of a celebration of life, which is good. It's a good thing, as long as it doesn't mean we're trying to sidestep around confronting death. Because as Christians, death is an important part of our understanding of life and also of how God works, right? But death creates tension with the imminent frame. Whether we are, atheists or staunchly religious, death presents a problem. And many of us probably think we have solved that problem in our different ways. We'll talk about this in a moment. But I find as a pastor that a funeral service is often one of the richest times for people in their encounter with the church. There is to go back to number one here, there is a vulnerability in that time, not to be taken advantage of by preachers, and preachers often do take advantage of that vulnerability in a kind of manipulative way, but to recognize that they are exposed and open to transcendence, to the presence of God in a way that ordinarily they are not, because death sort of opens us up in that way. Death has that effect on us, and we struggle, Christian or non, we struggle to come to terms with death. Questions or thoughts?
Ryan?
Yeah.
I know sometimes many people are put off by religion in general and the Christian religion because some ministers use it as a bludgeon. They try to scare you into being good.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do this and you don't do that and you aren't good and you blah, 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 boy, are you ever going to be sorry. And, that goes against forgiveness and love that we try to talk about.
Right.
We want people to behave well and do the right thing always, but I think that is partly why some people back away and say, nah, I don't think so.
Right.
No.
Right, so there's a simplicity there that is appealing to some, a clarity, I should say. But many others are turned off, and especially in a world now where we believe sort of in our core that ultimately we decide which path to take as we sort of, continue our spiritual journey. It's one thing for a preacher to present ideas for our consideration. It's another entirely for a preacher to say, here's how it is, and if you don't follow this way, then you're doomed. That doesn't really compute in the age of authenticity, in the imminent frame, that, in the world we inhabit today, by and large, that's not going to be a winning message. You're right. So here's another quote from James Smith. He says, "The question isn't whether we inhabit the imminent frame, but how." So again, to that point that we are all secular, we all belong to this worldview, right? We all have as our starting point the imminent frame. What Taylor will spend the latter portion of his book arguing is that there are different ways for us to inhabit the imminent frame, different ways for us to live with this new mindset. So one of his key ideas here is what he calls spin, and there is an open spin on the imminent frame, and there is a closed spin. And basically, what he is describing under this term spin is a way to construe the imminent frame so that we are certain that it is one way and not the other, so that we can forget about all these tensions and have a very clear, very straightforward, to get back to the clarity you were kind of hinting at, Neva, a very straightforward understanding of the world we inhabit. It is either completely open to transcendence, or it is completely closed. And there are no ifs, ands, or buts. So these are your very, very simplistic, clear, you might use the term fundamentalist to describe this worldview, whether we're talking about religious fundamentalists or atheist fundamentalists. It's an all or nothing sort of perspective. And what that does is it rescues us from the tension. It rescues us from the challenge of recognizing that though we have chosen one way, others choose another way, and we could have chosen another way, and may yet, at some point in our lives, as our journey takes its twists and turns, we may yet choose another way, right? There's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty there. The spin, as Taylor describes it, is one way or the other way. He uses a phrase to describe it as the false aura of the obvious. We convince ourselves that our take, or rather our spin, because he'll use the word take in a moment, that our spin is obvious. And everybody who's got two wits to rub together would see it just the way that we do, right? Doesn't sound familiar at all, right? So again, it is a kind of self-protective measure, right? It is an act of defense against living, inhabiting a world that is characterized in a fundamental way by uncertainty. So if you remember last week when I talked about, in my sermon, I talked about all of the choice we have and streaming shows and things, and that we end up with this nagging sense in the back of our minds that we've made our choice, but maybe we didn't make the best choice, that there's always something else we could have chosen. That's an uneasy kind of place to live, right? And so having a particular spin on the immanent frame, closed or open, absolves us of that uncertainty and the challenges that brings. Also makes it easier to deal with people that see it wrong, right? Yeah. So I provided you last week, I think, with Charles Taylor's almost tongue-in-cheek description of the immanent frame, meaning this is not what he ascribes to, but this is the way some people articulate the immanent frame. What he's doing here is showing what a closed spin looks like, right? This is how you might articulate a closed spin in the immanent frame. 1, science has shown that God does not exist and that religion is no longer necessary. 2, again, false aura of the obvious. Science has shown it. We know it to be true, so just, keep up, right? Number 2, we got here by sloughing off practices and beliefs tied to an older, less sophisticated worldview. Religious people, they just haven't grown up yet. They just haven't matured. And we're trying to bring them along, and they haven't reached the same heights of maturity and sophistication as we have. Number 3, as a society, we can pursue the common good without reference to religious doctrine or interference from religious authorities. We don't need religion in order to be a good society and create a good society. And number 4, as individuals, we pursue what we determine for ourselves to be good and right. And nobody, especially no religious dogma, needs to tell us, right? So here's an articulation of what a closed spin would look like. An open spin would be similarly strident, but in favor, of course, of the existence of God, God's will for humanity, and how we're supposed to live, and which church we're supposed to attend, and that sort of thing, right? So that gives you kind of a flavor of what he's talking about when he's talking about spin. It is one way that we inhabit the immanent frame. According to Taylor, not the best way, right? Not the best way. Any thoughts, questions?
So is it, and I know I realize this is an open question, depends on the individual, but if you have someone that's close to you that believes some of these things, try to convince them otherwise, or how do you do that, especially if maybe you're not armed with the information you really need at that point?
So the question is, how do you convince someone who maybe is operating from one of these spins?
How do you?
Right. Well, I think there's a fundamental flaw built into the desire and the effort to convince, and that is that it is sort of like the whole endeavor of apologetics, Christian apologetics. It presumes that there is proof available, and that proof can dislodge these deep-seated viewpoints. But these viewpoints are not necessarily the result of pure reason, right? As I said, these are defense mechanisms. One way or another, maybe we've experienced the challenges or the tensions of living in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty and doubt, and this is how we've resolved that. And if you take that away from me, Jake, then you place me in a terrible position. And so I'm going to hold to that I'm going to hold on for dear life, right? That's not to say that people don't emerge out of. In fact, many of us may describe our own faith journey as an emerging out of a very closed spin, or rather a very rigid spin, as Taylor's describing. Whether it was a fundamentalist religion or fundamentalist atheism, that's a common spiritual journey. But when you're talking to someone who kind of occupies this mindset, you're not speaking the same language as them, or you're not broadcasting on the same frequency, and they probably just won't pick up what you're saying. So just love them. Just love them. It's my pastoral advice. So, one of the realities that we've been alluding to about living in the immanent frame is what Taylor calls cross pressure. We experience this cross pressure in the immanent frame, being pulled between belief and unbelief, right? Being pulled between one spin and the other spin. And what this does is it fragilizes our worldview, right? It makes fragile our belief system. Because again, it goes back to that idea that we could choose differently. And gosh, look at all these people around me. They've chosen differently. How are things going for them? And then I read this book by Christopher Hitchens, and he says, God is a delusion, and religion is evil. And then I, read another book by Francis Collins, and says the evidence for God is woven throughout, what physicists have discovered in the universe, and you're getting pulled back and forth, right? That's cross pressure, and it happens all the time, in subtle ways, in not so subtle ways. It's just part of living in the immanent frame. To quote Andrew Root, he says this: secular 3, that is this version of secularization we're talking about, right? He says, secular 3 pulls a dirty trick. It tells people to feel, to dive deeply into their experiences. But following these experiences too deeply opens you to mystery or longing that moves you to see beyond the natural and the material. Secular 3 then admonishes you for these experiences, negating them with doubt. So this kind of describes the tensions that we started with. Namely, that we, as we go about life, we recognize that ordinary life is rich with deep meaning and moments of great significance. And in the age of authenticity, experience is the coin of the realm, right? And we, our experience is sort of our main authority, and we follow what resonates with us and what rings true for us. But Root is saying, just don't follow it too far, right? Because you follow it too far, and what you might discover is the transcendent. And there can't be any transcendent in the immanent frame, right? Root, of course, doesn't believe that. But he's acknowledging the difficulties of what Taylor calls this cross pressure, or the ways in which our perspective on the world is made fragile. When's he going to give us answers? When's he going to give us answers? So Charles Taylor talks a little bit about William James as if everybody knows who he is, and I don't. But he was a psychologist and philosopher, according to Wikipedia, at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Right around the same time as Thomas Hardy. Remember that poem I showed you, God's Funeral? So this kind of skepticism about religion is in the air. William James was a philosopher of religion, and he talked about religious experience. And I guess in his writings, which Taylor has studied and lectured on in other venues, James represents for him a clear articulation of this cross pressure, this pull. And it leads Taylor to suggest what he calls, and it's not going to catch on, I promise, a Jamesian open space. This is what Taylor calls it. A Jamesian open space. An open space along the lines of what James describes, where basically we try intentionally to inhabit a space where we are getting pulled in both directions, and we just stay there. We refuse to settle for a spin on the immanent frame, right? For the false aura of the obvious. And instead, we try to occupy that middle space where, yes, we're being pulled toward unbelief sometimes, but we're also being pulled the other way, right? It's a kind of openness that allows us to remain open to the transcendent, even in the immanent frame, without detaching ourselves entirely from the world, right? And from the ways that other people understand and view the world.
So is that good?
Yes, according to Taylor. You can decide for yourself whether you think that's good. But Taylor says, he makes the point that divine action is hard to see in the immanent frame, right? In an enchanted world a few hundred years ago, divine action was everywhere. But now divine action is hard to see, which means we can just decide that divine action is non-existent, or we can inhabit the world in a way that, acknowledges it's hard to see, but also we might see it, right? We might experience it. We're not going to write it off out of hand. We're going to remain open to the possibility of experiencing divine action. And this is that open space. And so what Taylor talks about instead of a spin is a take. He says, there are open and closed takes on the immanent frame. And this is a little bit less of a strident kind of closing off of your perspective and more of an openness. And there are those with a closed take, meaning they obviously lean, these might be more your agnostics than your hardcore atheists, but they have a closed take on the immanent frame. But in those moments of loss or great joy or significance, there is still kind of a deep-seated openness that there is something going on here, right? And by the same token, an open take kind of has as its default position that there is a transcendent reality that we have access to in some way or another. It's hard. I'm going to make it my life's journey to experience it and discover it. But there are going to be times where I kind of get pulled in this direction, and maybe it's in one of those deep moments, those moments of suffering where we feel like this doesn't make any sense. I don't understand this at all. And I find a lot more comfort in just writing it all off, and I'm going to get sort of tugged in this direction. But then probably tugged back again, right? So it's that open space. It's sort of trying to inhabit a very difficult in-between that Taylor is talking about. The point here is in particular that we don't need to resolve it. We don't need to resolve the tension. Resolving the tension is to essentially close off a whole world of possibilities in terms of our experience of transcendence, whether we choose the religious or the non-religious spin. It is to close ourselves off from divine action, right? To resolve it prematurely. Mark, do you have a thought?
So Corin Hunch started the area of structure activity I was in, and he's about to die. I talked to him. He's struggling with that, but he wants to share So he talks about all the coincidences. He points out all the coincidences that gave rise to where he is and what his position was. And it's coincidence for me. I think, well, that's just the coordination of God.
Mm-hmm.
Two different
Yep.
ways of looking.
Right. So coincidences are often interpreted in radically different ways, depending on the worldview underlying it. All right. So let's try to turn to some answers. I should have put a question mark after answer just so you didn't get your hopes up. Again, we're talking about how to live faithfully today, how to live in an imminent frame, right? How to express our faith, how to follow Jesus faithfully. And the first is ministry. I don't mean church ministry, ordained ministry. I mean ministry in terms of service. And this is a theme that Root takes up in his first book, Faith Formation in a Secular Age. And he talks a lot about ministry. He looks at Paul on the road to Damascus. And Paul, actually it's Saul at that point, you'll remember. And Saul has an experience of the risen Christ. He's struck blind, and he is taken off to some stranger's home, Ananias. And Ananias, following what God has told him to do, heals Paul's blindness and sets him on the road to becoming an apostle, right? And Root describes this as an experience of Saul dying and being ministered to, right? Which, and this has very significant echoes in my sermon today, but for Root, what he recognizes in this is a pattern of death and resurrection. That's the pattern of Jesus' ministry, and it might just be the pattern of reality, right? And it might just be the route for our experience of God's presence, right? Namely, we have our own death experiences, by which I mean suffering or difficulty or loss, and Christ ministers to us in those experiences. And in the same way, we are called to minister to others, to enter into the suffering and hardship of others, and to be ministers in that way. In Philippians, Paul writes this, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness. And being found in appearance as a human, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." This was Jesus' trajectory, and this ought to be ours as well, Paul says, right? Andrew Root writes, "In Western Christianity, too often what has mattered is that people know and therefore consent to the forensic act of Jesus' atoning work. They show they believe this by going to church. Faith is consenting to an epistemological frame." That's sort of a philosophy of knowing, not an experience of finding a new being inside the experience of death. So what he's saying is the church has so often said that what matters is what goes on up here, right? Do you think and believe the right things about what Jesus did and how it works? And that has for so long been how the church has kind of understood what sets Christians apart from non-Christians. And Root is suggesting that it's much more about this kind of experience of death and resurrection and participating in that. All right, so another response is story. We, as Christians, have a very particular story that we tell about who we are and where we've come from. And that story is the source, it's the foundation of our identity, a shared identity. And in the age of authenticity, the world we live in today, there's a lot of pressure to write our own story, right? To be free thinkers, nonconformists, to not be bound by a narrative. But to imagine that our existence within a story is is a kind of prison is a misunderstanding of what a story is, what a story does, right? A story does not necessarily need to be lived as a limitation. A story, like those meaning-rich moments that we experience in life, is organizing, meaning it helps us put the pieces of our experience together into a coherent whole. It helps us understand who we are, and it helps us to think about who God is in relation to all of those bits and pieces of our own experience. Now, I want to contrast a story with creeds and confessions. Creeds and confessions of the church are byproducts of the story, but they are not the story itself. The story itself can't be captured by a creed. We have kind of operated as if we have to follow this particular chain of confessions from Nicaea all the way through the Reformation and now into the 20th century. This is a Presbyterian church anyways. But even the confessions that we have in our book of confessions don't constitute a coherent story. They represent the church in different times and places, and they articulate the faith in different ways. What we're talking about when we talk about a story is more the communion of saints, the cloud of witnesses, right? And the cloud of witnesses includes those great beloved heroes and also the crazies, right? The ones who definitely did not live the faith the way that I have chosen to live my faith, but they're a part of the cloud of witnesses. Charles Taylor says it's better not to think about the story as a rigid definition so much as, let me find the right phrase. What does he call it? No idea what he calls it. He calls it something to the effect of whole itineraries toward God. Whole itineraries toward God. So here's another way to think about our spiritual path, right? Our journey is a kind of itinerary toward God. And each of us carves out a different path, and in a way, kind of how I presented it last week talking about the age of authenticity, I kind of looked a little bit down my nose at you choose your own adventure sort of perspective on faith. But at the same time, that is how we think about our faith journey. And the cloud of witnesses represents countless possible faith journeys, itineraries toward God that can teach us a lot. It can teach us some of the things not to do. Luther was a real jerk, but also really important to the life of the church. And it can teach us the things that we should do, right? But the point is not to say that if I choose to be a Christian, then I have to believe X, Y, and Z in order to belong, but instead to join with this great cloud of witnesses who throughout history have struggled and tried to find their way to God, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can find well-worn paths, and there are multiple well-worn paths that have been created by the cloud of witnesses. And there's not just one, and the Presbyterian path is manifold. There are many different Presbyterian paths, and it's not a simple, straightforward matter of sort of just diving in and then we're just all in it together, right? It doesn't have to deny the individuality of our spiritual journey. The other thing about a story now, in the immanent frame, it used to be that the story was received and accepted, and that was the kind of the organizing story for our conception of the universe, right? Remember last week I shared Genesis chapter 2, and then a very different perspective on how we fit in to the universe and the story that we tell. It used to be that it was just a received story, and we believed that that story goes back to time out of mind and so far, back beyond human memory. But in the immanent frame, we choose to participate in a story, right? We choose to claim the Christian story, which means we don't enter into it naively. Instead, we enter into it knowingly. We know what it is. We know it's a story. We know that we are choosing an organizing story that gives us our identity when we could choose others. We're not choosing it because it's the only story, right? We're choosing it because it's the story that we want to be a part of, that we want to participate in, that we want this story to give shape to our lives going forward. And that doesn't have to mean that if you've chosen a different story, call it a religion if you want, that you have chosen wrong. And you need to get on the team over here, right? That completely misses the point of what it means to participate in the Christian story. Thoughts, questions? All right. Faith community. I've already talked a little bit. There's overlap between story and community. But this kind of grows out of the recognition that none of us gets the whole picture, right? We might be our own spiritual directors, our own spiritual guides who get to choose our path in life, but that doesn't mean that we grasp the whole picture. And joining together in community is one way to acknowledge that, to recognize that we, not only do we not now, but we never will grasp the whole picture. I spoke with somebody after Wednesday morning men's Bible study this past week who told me something I've heard many times before, that when we get to the Apostles' Creed, the part where it says he descended into hell, that they don't say that part, right? Because it doesn't express what they believe. And I think that's fine. I think that's fine. But when I say it because I'm speaking the words of the community. I'm giving expression to the faith of the community. And that our creeds function, at least in part, as a kind of collecting and amplifying statement of what it means to be a part of this community. It doesn't have to be thought of as a doctrinal exercise so much as a kind of joining our voices with, again, that cloud of witnesses that includes the heroes and the crazies, right? And we're all together and we're participating together in that community. And we are able to better sense the ways that God works when we're together. Because God has only worked in my life in certain ways, right? And my life has been pretty privileged and pretty smooth. And God has only worked in my life in certain ways. But we have all experienced different things. And we have all seen God operate in our lives in different ways. So just imagine how impoverished our picture of God's work would be if all we had to go on was what God has done for me. But when we're in community, we begin to recognize that the ways that God brings us back are so many and varied. And that nourishes the community, right? We're not talking about belonging in a strict membership kind of sense, right? We're talking about participating in a story, claiming a story, and we're talking about joining with a community of sojourners, of people who are on this spiritual journey together, and trying to set aside the strict boundary marking that was so much a feature of the Catholic Church prior to the Reformation and the Protestant Church after the Reformation. And the last one that is resonance. And here is maybe an answer or a counterpart to what I've been talking about when I say meaning. Religion is not just the search for meaning. Andrew Root, borrowing from another thinker, uses the word resonance. Resonance conveys a sense of a little bit of a back and forth, right? That resonance is not just about me experiencing meaning, right? Because I can go to a concert and I can experience meaning. I can go to a worship service and I can experience meaning, and I can walk away and take that meaning with me, right? But resonance has in the sense that Root uses it, is a reception, a receptivity to the work of God, and then acting in response, right? And that acting in response could mean a million different things. But the point is that we don't just see our lives as oriented toward finding meaning, because That is very much kind of the perspective of the age of authenticity in a more negative way. And it's that higher selfishness, as David Brooks called it, right? I'm just looking for meaning for me, and that's the most important thing. But instead to recognize that when we experience meaning, that it calls forth something from us. And that's this sense of resonance. And Charles Taylor says, I don't think I wrote this down. I wish I had. No, I did. He says, we need to enlarge our palette of points of contact with fullness. We need to enlarge our palette of points of contact with fullness. Fullness would be Taylor's version of resonance. We need to enlarge our palette. We need to put ourselves in places and around people where we are more likely to encounter the transcendent, right? We need to structure our lives in a way that we are continually exposed to God at work in our lives. And if we don't believe in God, exposed to that resonance, right, that draws us deeper, not just into our own selves, but into the lives of others. And the more, and yet coming to church is a good way to do that, but it's certainly not the only way, right? The more opportunities we have in our lives for resonance, the more we will experience it, the more we will discover the deeper things of life, the more we will interact with the work of God in the world, because God is working in the world. And if we're not there, we miss it, right? And we don't get to participate in it. And resonance is that outward motion to all of this, so that it doesn't just stay up here in my head or here in my heart, in my life, in my journey, but instead I think it was a couple weeks ago now, I talked about life not being all about my own purpose, but a call that is waiting to be answered, right? And so the life of faith is about cultivating an openness to that call, cultivating an openness to the transcendent, the divine. There's so many words for it, right? But cultivating that openness so that when we encounter it, we hear it, and we're ready to respond to it. So these aren't like, you know, if you're taking notes, they aren't like, okay, step 1 this, step 2 this, step 3 this. It's not, sadly, it's not that simple. But it is possible to live faithfully in the immanent frame, in a secular world. And it's possible to live in a secular world in a way that doesn't require us to, you know, keep at arm's length all those secular people who don't believe what I believe about God or choose to live the way that I live. But instead, we can inhabit this world in an open way, open to God, open to others, in a loving way, and in a way that calls forth a lot more from us than we might otherwise be willing or think ourselves capable of giving. So we'll close there. I'll pray, and we'll just pretend I solved all of the problems. God, we are so grateful for this life, for the days that you give us. Each moment is a gift, an opportunity, a chance to open ourselves to you and to the others who are around us, the stranger and the friend, an opportunity to discover your presence among us. We pray that you would continue your work in us, continue shaping and reshaping and making us into your faithful church, so that we might bear faithful witness to your kingdom even now, even in this secular world, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks, everybody.